Clearly, I do not know the personal experiences of everybody else here. And so that's what we want to talk about and share about today, because really part of being an ally is really being a learner, and we can learn from each other. So I actually looked up synonyms for the word ally in preparation for today, and I liked a lot of the phrases that they had there: banding together, adhering, conjoining, and my favorite was fellow traveler. I really kind of identified with that. I really liked that. And so these are some of the mental pictures I want you to think about today when we're talking about allyship. It's really a no group left behind state of mind. So if one of my human travelers is experiencing injustice or oppression at any level, then I want to be there to help and travel along and support. And really, one of the biggest parts of being an ally, like I said, is being a learner. So I'm hoping to learn even more today. And that's really the mindset that we really need to have, is that we're going to learn more each day and grow each day. And so the second thing that I wanted to say before we really get started on this is that you may feel uncomfortable today. We're going to be talking about a lot of tough topics. I presented this to an adult, to providers, to agencies a few weeks ago, and it brought up a lot of anger from some people. So these topics can bring up a lot of emotions. It might be anger, it might be sadness, it might be guilt, it might cause you to be reflective, defensive. But here's my really big challenge to you today: is to lean into those emotions, not use them, as reasons to shut down, saying, for example, I'm angry, I don't want to talk about this, or well, I don't want to say the wrong thing, I'm scared. But instead, using those emotions to have conversations in a safe space and jump off to have better dialogue. And like I said, really, take on that role as a learner today. So I just wanted to say those two things before we get going. And this is something that I found specifically from research on how to be a multicultural social worker. It's really acknowledging that if we are going to be social workers in the field, that we need to commit and stand alongside oppressed and impoverished populations, and really engage in our activities to become better learners and better allies. Okay. So here's our objectives for this brown bag: is we're going to review some definitions that are going to help us navigate on how to analyze and implement change, if change is needed and where. We're going to learn how to use self-reflection, self-regulation, and we're really going to dive into the person and the environment perspective to manage and reduce bias and increase our understanding. And then we're going to recognize how we can advocate for human rights at lots of different levels: individual, cultural, and organizational levels. And I hear myself talking fast. I'm just trying to get a lot of information out to you in a short period of time. So I'm gonna talk a little bit, and then we're gonna open the floor to discussion. So when we're talking about implicit bias, this is known as also unconscious or hidden biases. These are negative associations that people unknowingly hold. They're expressed automatically and without conscious awareness. And we're going to do a deep dive on bias a little bit later in the presentation, but I did want to highlight that it is a normal function of human brains, so all people do have bias. Racism is any differential treatment or behavior due to race. So when I'm talking about treatment or behavior, I'm talking about perception, judgment, treatment, and this is regardless of intent. It's not that someone is intending necessarily, but sometimes it happens without intent. And we're going to be talking about racism today, not as an all or nothing, but more of a spectrum. And that kind of connects to bias. If we don't know necessarily what we're saying, we might be having some of these behaviors, and that they need to be brought to light and discussed. So structural, also known as institutional or systematic racism, is a system of structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage minorities. And this is very closely connected to white privilege. And it refers to whites' historical and contemporary advantages in access to education, jobs, and livable wages, home ownership, benefit, and wealth. And I added sense of safety. That wasn't in the original definition I found, but I think that's important, despite socioeconomic status. And I just want to take a beat here a little bit. Here's where some of these emotions come in. And I want to talk about how systematic racism connects to white privilege. So they're very closely enmeshed. When we're talking about systematic racism, we're going back really to the inception of our country. Our country was founded, as we know, by a group of white males. They were leaving their country of origin and coming here for opportunity. And they really created laws that were meant to sustain and benefit their financial interests in starting the new colony. So indigenous people or people of color were only ever considered in those new laws and how they could make money for the white males that were starting the nation. So persons of color were never really intended to earn wealth in this country, and the laws were constructed purposely to prevent it, so to prevent ownership, property, home ownership, land, and anything that was to earn money. And to say that this is slow to change is really an understatement. When we look at all of the indexes in the United States that are still in place today that measure wealth, white males actually top all of those indexes still today. So, it really kind of measures, when we measure wealth in America, those top indexes still reflect white male privilege there. So when we're talking about systematic racism going forward in this presentation, we're referring to these laws and policies and procedures that seek to restrict wealth. And I'm going to say it again: safety, benefits, and freedoms to specific groups. And when we're speaking about systematic changes, we're talking about the need to create equity and access. So anti-racism is a practice, a set of beliefs, and a value system that recognizes this historic oppression and violence perpetrated against BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, in the U.S., and works to educate people about this oppression and end it in our current day. We're talking about being an ally or allyship. We're talking about a person or people who make an intentional, I'm going to say that word again, intentional decision to understand, empathize, and act in support of others. And this might involve standing up when you see something wrong, and it might involve risking your own sense of comfort and putting yourself out there, and it can involve serving as a witness. We're talking about diversity. We're talking about a term that refers to a wide range of national, ethnic, gender, racial, or other backgrounds of people. It includes, I'm going to omit somebody, there we go. It includes all the ways in which people may differ, and it recognizes everyone and every group as part of a grand collective that should be valued. So I put equity and equality here together, and I really grasped these concepts when I kind of compared and contrast, and so that's why I set it up like this. So when we're talking about equity, it is the effective implementation of diversity. It's authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals or groups into activities, processes, and decision making in a way that shares power. And so sometimes when we're using equity and equality, they kind of get interchanged and we might lose the meaning of each. So I like to use an analogy here to kind of separate these two concepts. And the analogy is, if you and I go out to dinner and I order the steak and lobster and a side salad and all the accoutrements and a bottle of wine, and the bill comes, right, and you just got a bowl of soup and a glass of water, okay, and the bill comes to $100. If we're going to split it equally, then we would each pay $50. That's splitting the bill equally. I'm going to pay $50, you're going to pay $50. But if we're splitting the bill equitably, since I got the really super expensive meal, I'm going to pay for my meal. I'm going to pay the $90. And since you got soup and water, you would pay the $10. So they're both fair divisions. They both have utility. But when we're talking about equality versus equity, we really need to take a look at the situation and decide which is the more fair division. When we're talking about inclusion, we're referring to the intentional ongoing effort to ensure that diverse individuals fully participate in all aspects of organizational work. And that includes decision making, and it refers to the ways that diverse participants are valued and respected members of that organization. Oops. And the last one is intersectionality, a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create unique modes of discrimination and privilege. So for example, I'm a woman, so I understand what that means for me, but I am not a Hispanic woman, so I don't understand where that intersects. And I identify as a straight woman, so I don't understand how anyone from the LGBTQ community. So see how those things interconnect and overlap. That's what, when we're looking at a person and their needs and where they might be feeling discriminated against, we need to look at all the aspects of the person's identity and where they intersect. So I'm going to provide you with another analogy here. Let's pretend that we're going to open a shoe factory. Okay, and this is going to help us kind of review these terms one more time. So we're starting a shoe factory, and we decide that there are a lot of people out there with a lot of different shoe needs. Everybody deserves a pair of shoes, but everybody has very different shoe needs. And some people don't even want shoes, right? That's diversity. When we're talking about equality, we're going to give everybody in America a pair of shoes. When we're talking about equity, we're going to make sure that the shoes that we give them is the size that they need. So if I'm a size 6, I don't get a size 8. I get the specific shoe that I need for my life. So inclusion means that as we're talking about how to design the shoes and deliver them and disperse them to everyone, that it's not just the CEOs making those decisions. Everyone from the truck driver to the shoe manufacturer, to the janitors, to everybody gets to sit at the table and decide how we're going to run the factory and how we're going to distribute the shoes. And intersectionality is talking about me as a person. I may need a set of work shoes, a set of jogging shoes, and a set of ballet slippers. That's what I might need. And my work shoes might be my ballet slippers. I might be a ballerina, right? So we were taking a look at everybody's unique design and what they need specifically in order to succeed. So that's just an analogy I like to use to kind of review those terms one more time. So where do we start? Now that we understand the terms and the language that we're talking about, how do we start to become an ally? And this is part of the self-reflection part. It really starts with us. So we're going to talk here a lot about self-reflection. It's actually going to be one of our discussion questions at the end. It's really where you can get to know yourself and take a deeper look, pushing yourself to be uncomfortable, recognize your own defensive reactions. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I feeling upset right now? And like I said, leaning into that emotion. There is a rule in social work that we start where the client is. We start at the beginning. So start with what you know and then push further. How did I get to know that? What is my culture of origin that might have set that up? Self-reflect, research, listen to others. Use people as their own historian. Don't make assumptions, ask people questions, and then truly listen to the answer. Don't have an answer already in mind, but truly listen with an open mind. And like I said, try to differentiate between comfort and safety. It is a safe space for you to explore topics. It might make you feel uncomfortable, but is it a safety issue? Can I accept that discomfort to push a little further? And here's where we're really going to talk about bias. I told you we're going to dive a little bit deeper into it. So as I said, bias is a normal part of the human brain. It's how we organize a really overwhelming amount of information very quickly all day long. Whether you're aware of it or not, all this information is coming at you and your brain is organizing it and putting it into categories just so you can process it the most efficiently. It's a universal function of every brain. We rely on patterns that seem predictable. We rely on muscle memory. So how many times have you been driving in a car and you get to your destination and you're like, man, I was thinking the whole time. I don't even remember getting here. It's just kind of that muscle memory your brain takes over. And we categorize, animals, we categorize food, we categorize tasks and organize tasks that we have to do. And then we assign emotions to those. So for instance, we feel differently about puppies than we do alligators, right? We might pet a puppy, we might feel joyous when we see one walking, but when we see an alligator, we don't. We take off or we protect ourselves. We've categorized that to protect ourselves. But what happens is when we do this so quickly and we do this for people, then we start developing stereotypes. And they're very emotionally assigned, stereotypes are. It's how we make sense of other people. As a woman, when I'm walking down the street at night by myself, I make assumptions by men that I don't even know, right? I give myself space, or I cross the street, or just am more hyper vigilant. We make those assumptions all day long, and we put energy and emotions into those decisions. But what can happen is they can lead us to misinterpret people. So for example, we can misread facial expressions and body language. Silence can be misinterpreted as belligerence. What if a black male is also walking by himself and he's trying to protect himself in the same way that I just said I do sometimes as a woman? And so, what if he passes a police officer or a group of people that he doesn't know, and he breaks eye contact and he kind of becomes quiet? Sometimes that gets mistaken for belligerence. And so we've heard police officers say, well, he just didn't look right, or something feels off. There's many stories in the paper about white people or white families calling the 911 on black families having a picnic, or a young girl selling water. So all these people were making assumptions based off of feelings and stereotypes rather than, really doing a deep dive on where that's coming from. And we make these assumptions in a microsecond. So it is part of how our brain is wired, but we need to care about that. And really, speed and ambiguity are the biggest triggers to bias. The faster we have to make that decision, again, you'll hear police officers say, "We had to make a quick decision. There was no time to think," right? And it's really the enemy of self-reflection is speed. So we want to be able to slow down and take a minute and not make such quick decisions. It would really help with our bias, and really talk to others, talk to those who know us, talk to those who are part of our culture. Like, for instance, I'm part of the female culture, so talk to other women about how they feel when they're feeling anxious about being alone, or what they're recognizing. Bring in your support systems. The other part that you can do to be part of the solution is create a safe space to have that dialogue. I'm challenging you to lean into your emotions. So creating a safe space, and just remember that, what might be a safe space for you may not be for others. You have to allow them to have their history, and have their history of being hurt, their history of trauma, their history of being dismissed, or not trusting. We all have our feelings about our safety because of our culture and because of our past. And so we want to make as big a safe space as possible. And when we're talking about trauma victims, or interacting with trauma victims, or people who have had trauma in their past, I always say that as a clinician, I will earn your trust until, and I just leave that wide open. I let the other person tell me and move at their pace, because I'm not the one who's experiencing it. I need to leave a lot of space. And like I said, just know that there's probably a big history there of what does it feel like when you're completely vulnerable to someone and then there's just silence? There's just crickets. It's a really strange, awkward place to be in. And so that person might have had experience with someone just being silent when they shared their experience. Arguing and rationalization. Well, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to say that. Or you're just playing the race card, those kind of statements, arguing back instead of really listening to what the person is trying to tell you. It can be very invalidating. It can be seen as very hostile. So how are we going to what I want to do is help you apply what you're learning in class and in your internship and in LEAD, to move forward and have a strategy. So if we've educated ourselves on language, and we look at the research, and we decide that there is a need for change, and we want to be an ally, and we're participating in self-reflection, and we're exploring our bias, then how do we put those efforts into action? How do we take what we're learning and become strong allies and agents for change? So there's really 3 levels that we need to address oppression and bias on, and they're all very very connected. So on an individual level, we're trying to change people's biases and ideas person to person by having those conversations, by leaning into difficult questions, but also by setting boundaries. So I just want to give you one example. I gave a training similar to this to social workers at a school district yesterday, and one of the ladies there, she was a white woman, and she said, I'm sitting in the break room every day, and I hear people come in and they're complaining. They're complaining about race and students of different races, and they look at me like I'm going to support the conversation. And she's like, what do you suggest I say in that moment? So we talked about her setting boundaries, and it ranges from coming out and saying, I think you are assuming that I'm agreeing with what you're saying, and I don't agree with what you're saying at all. Just kind of setting those boundaries. And we also talked to her about also providing education, and I'm just going to give you an example. One of the teachers would come in, and the language almost sounded like they were complaining about a student in their class and giving that student privileges due to race. And the person complaining sounded to her like a victim. And we just kind of visited that for a little while and looked at that for a little while. The teacher is not a victim here. They're not victimized, right? They may be frustrated, they may be angry, they may be feeling guilty, a wide variety of emotions. But what I suggested was that she say to them, "You sound frustrated, tell me more." If we take somebody who is saying something that we disagree with and we say, "Well, you're an idiot," right? That's not really providing a safe space for someone to lean into those emotions and explore that more, and for us as allies to help connect the dots on what they're saying and why it might be hurtful. So, tying this all together, I encouraged her to really create a safe space for dialogue, but also to set boundaries and say, "Well, I don't agree with you, but I hear that you're frustrated. Tell me more about it," and maybe help direct that conversation in a more productive way. So that's individual. We're trying to change people's minds, and don't underestimate yourself as an influencer. You can influence the culture and the language just by changing yours. We're also looking at cultural changes, and this is really positive peer-pressured corrective actions. Like that woman in the break room, she could say, we don't talk like that here. We don't say that here. That's not okay. I had a student in a nursing home setting where they were being derogatory towards a transgender patient, and in the hallways where everyone could hear. And she said, I think maybe we should take this to the break room and have a conversation. This isn't something we should be doing. Kind of trying to change those social norms and what's acceptable in your agency or in your family or in your classroom, changing those social norms. Institutionally, we're talking about rules and laws. So one that's very simple to tell you, there's an institutional law that every building has to have a stall in the bathroom that accommodates wheelchairs, right? Or they won't give them occupancy. So those are more institutional policies that we need to look at. And they're very much aligned to these three. If you change the policy, but you don't change the individual, then you risk resentment or you risk obstinance. So think about the laws where they tried to make people wear masks during the pandemic, right? People got hung up on that and thought it was policy policing, and really got obstinate about it and resented it, rather than a culture being promoted where we're all banding together here to protect the health and safety of vulnerable. So people they forgot to dive deep into that, and they got hung up on just the policy and they became obstinate. So we need to change individuals' culture and institutional laws all at the same time, and in order to prevent slip back or resentment. And that's why social workers are really so essential, because we're working on all three areas to achieve sustainability and change. And I'm going to give you one more example just to divide these up. And we're almost done. We're almost at the end of our time, and we're going to open to discussion. But an example of a study that kind of shows you how these are intertwined is a recent study concluded or found that white women in labor in the hospital received faster and higher administration of pain meds than their BIPOC counterparts. And so I just want to illustrate how these three things can interact. So if a woman of color is complaining that she's having pain in the hospital, an individual nurse may make a decision based on bias not to provide her pain medicine. The cultural level is the group of nurses or the group of staff that she's working with doesn't say, "Hey, this person's in trouble, we need to go in and help her. Is there something we can do?" And really create that positive peer pressure. And then institutionally, does the hospital have policies that protect vulnerable populations and make sure that they're getting treated equally and equitably when they're in pain? So you can see how all of those are really, really connected together. So the good news is that most people want to do the right thing. So how can we prepare to empower ourselves and be prepared should conflict arise? And I put a reference down here at the bottom. Miss Duhaney wrote a book here, Racing in Academia, and she suggests that being prepared and empowering ourselves way ahead of time, having a plan to attack our fears or our bias in advance, and how to advocate for others is a good way to be prepared when it happens. So yesterday I did a site visit, and one of my students, when I asked, are you able to interact with demographics different than yourself? She said yes, and she said, I'm having a hard time. She was very forthcoming. She leaned into the discussion, and she said, I found out at this placement that I have a bias towards religious people. I don't like religions. And when I ask someone how they're coping and they say, well, God will get me through, she said, I really go to a negative place. I'm having a hard time finding empathy for that. So first and foremost, I commended her for being honest. but she was trying to do the right thing. She said, how can I reframe my brain? Where is my bias coming from? And she welcomed a conversation where we could really open that up and take a look at it. And part of that included her coming up and being prepared with strategies that if someone says that in the future, how do I check myself? How do I become prepared? How do I really listen? How do I do self-reflection? And so preparing and empowering ourselves ahead of time is a really good strategy. Now, of course, that can't always happen. You know, things go down that we can't always be prepared for. But the more we feel empowered to say something, or we have something in our toolbox that we can bring out. Also, you know, social equity is very important. Do you have people around you who support you and are there to back you as well? And also, you know, if if you're coming up against a wall, if you're trying to bring something to light and someone's not listening, is there someone else you can go to? Is there someone higher up? Is there someone different? Can you bring in more resources? Can you knock on someone else's door? And I'm just going to close by saying one more example. I listened to a podcast. It's called Everybody Relax. Everybody Just Relax. It's actually a social work podcast. Um, but the speaker, the person who runs it, he talks about his experience as a Black male social worker and not really having a lot of mentors around. Um, as a Black male social worker, we don't have many males in the field as it is. And so he really expresses and was really honest about his loneliness in the field. And he was working for a trauma center where sometimes they had to Baker Act patients. And that would involve, you know, calling the police on the patient, putting the handcuffs on the patient. And he really was triggered by that. His own experience and trauma as a Black male with being pulled from his car or being put in handcuffs against his will. Every time he would have to Baker Act a patient, he really went through a traumatic experience. And he tried to talk to his supervisor, who was understanding, but was a white woman and just didn't understand it at the same level he did. And so he searched and searched until he found a great mentor where he could go during that traumatic time, to have a safe space and have increased social equity and to be able to vent and act like he wanted, you know, vent as angry as he wanted and not be misheard or mistaken. So really having that preparation where if you reach out for support and you're not feeling it, you know, how far are you willing to go? Are you willing to go search for it elsewhere, ask for help to look for mentors, ask for help to look for supports? Really trying to think ahead and line yourself up and empower yourself when you're in those sticky situations. So now we're going to open it to discussion. And I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Finnemore. She's going to lead the discussion.
Okay, so thank you, Robin, for going through all that super quick because that was a lot of material to take in. And we just have a few questions that we thought might help, you know, kind of get us thinking more about this. So, you know, we're really anxious to hear what you have to say, thinking about this. But how can we use self-reflection and self-regulation to manage and reduce implicit bias? So, would anybody like to speak?
I want to say thank you, and I have to cut out because I have to go back to my internship. So thank you for the information.
Thanks, Molly. I know we ran over a little.
I think I have one.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, the discussion for how we can use self-reflection, understanding more of yourself, I think is very important in understanding how other people can be as well. It can help you understand if you see the more difficult things in your life, in your own life, and the hard things that you're going through. It's easier to think, in my opinion, that other people are having difficulty as well, and they're not always in the same places as you. So increased self-reflection, I think, reduces implicit bias like more.
Cleaning up your own house, kind of, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
Making sure,
sorta.
yeah.
Like if you have a clean house, you know, or if you're cleaning your house and you know where all the dirt is, then you can know, oh, maybe their house is not as clean, and maybe they're trying, but maybe they didn't get to the garage before I did, or whatever, you know.
I think that's really important because sometimes that involves counseling of your own, or life management of your own. And I think that, I challenge social workers and social work students all the time, and that's some of what we're talking about with self-care, but we're reluctant as a profession to reach out for help. We think that because we're helping other people that we have to have everything in order, and we can't be humans. And so I always challenge social workers, you need to, everybody needs help at some point. And taking a look at all of that and healing some of that, you're right, goes a long way, for sure.
Hey, Robin, it's Britt. I was just gonna say that I was reading a book, My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, and it's about healing racialized trauma using somatic healing and the body experience, because he says that white supremacy and racism is not a mind thing, it is a body thing because of everything that we have experienced in America. So one of the things that he was saying in there is to make sure that you slow it down. And I know you were talking about how quick things happen, but the more we practice slowing down and breathing and self-regulating, then we can check, like we can do a gut check and say, like, is this real, or is this something that I've learned, or is this real, or is this an implicit bias that I might have? And that goes along with doing the work. But the more you practice that, the more you're able to trust your gut more quickly when situations do arise.
That's for sure. And I just want to comment on what you said about it being a body experience, which is, there's a lot of research right now, especially it really started to happen along the lines when all the police brutality started to be on the TV every single day. They were taking a look at the long-term effects, and it really is mimicking PTSD. In people of color, you're watching it happen on the TV. You're walking by and feeling the tension. You're protecting your own family. It's so deep and thick, and so it's starting to present as PTSD type symptoms. You're 100% right. And I just want to say too, when you're checking yourself and you're slowing down, I didn't get a chance to talk about this because we really kind of tried to tighten this training, but when there's a gentleman. Oh shoot, I'm losing his name, but I will find it. He goes around and he's been talking to police stations about racism, and again, it's on being on a spectrum, not you are or you aren't. And so he starts by asking, he asked one lieutenant, he said, how many guys of the 100 on your force do you think are racist? And he goes, well, we've got one or two bad apples, but for the most part, I mean, we really want to do the right thing. We really don't, we don't see color, was what the guy said, right? So so Robert said to him, let's do this a different way. Let's say you're in a cul-de-sac and you're just driving around a really family-friendly neighborhood, and you come across a group of boys and they're playing leapfrog over some cones, and they're moving the cones. They're not doing anything bad. They're just being mischievous, and they're, swinging the cones over their heads and stuff. He said, how many of your officers would treat a group of little white boys different than a group of little black boys doing the exact same behavior? And so when the lieutenant reflected and thought about that, he's like, well, I'm going to switch that number and say about 80 to 90% of my officers would probably react different. And he said, that's what we're talking about with racism. It doesn't have to be explicit violence. It's on a spectrum, and really taking a deep dive and finding out, where is that coming from? Why would they see those two groups different? And let's spend a little more time digging on that. So I agree with you, Britt. I think that it really is about slowing down and taking the time to assess and not rush. Yep.
Did anyone else want to add a comment before we move on?
I'm sorry, the man's name is Robert Livingston.
Great. Okay, so next question. How can we lean into vulnerability and understanding?
Okay, I'll answer again. If somebody else wants to answer, please feel free to interrupt me. I think that as a white person, it's especially crucial to be vulnerable when you're having these discussions and to admit that we drank the Kool-Aid of racism and white supremacy. Like we swam in the waters, and our particular flavor is American, but it's global Kool-Aid. So to own that and be like, you know what? Yeah, like I know that I have racist tendencies because I grew up here. My proximity to any other group doesn't really matter because it's still my experiences of being conditioned in this country, in this society. And so just to be vulnerable enough to like almost accept and embrace it, like, my God, yeah, I'm racist, please, like, let's start there. And then, you know, I am working every single day to counter the narratives that I grew up with. So I'm open to learning and I'm open to changing in any way I can. But just to acknowledge that, I think is really important.
I think I have another part for that too. Like how can we lean into the vulnerability and understanding is being able to ask questions. And I think you can see your own experience in life, but the vulnerable part and understanding part is like trying to understand other people's route through life or journey, because you know other people experience things different ways. You guys can share the different ways that you've gone about exposing your vulnerability and how the world has reacted to you, and how you can understand more about the world and each other through asking questions. So, I mean, just being willing to not always be right and be willing to learn more about what other people have.
You know, this is really where intersectionality can be really used too. You know, we want to make sure that we're taking everything into account for a person's experience. You know, there's vulnerabilities, there's lots of different layers of vulnerability there. So I'm just going to give you a personal experience. I was pumping gas one night at a gas station, and a gentleman came over and he was like, "Where are we going to dinner?" And I said, "Oh no," you know, I said in about 3 or 4 different ways that I wasn't interested, and he wasn't listening. And I was feeling very uncomfortable because he was not giving me any space at all. And after 2 or 3 times of asking him to leave me alone, a guy from the other side of the pump leaned around and said, "Dude, like, I believe she said no, like, go, leave her alone." You know, he kind of like intervened for me. So part of me felt relieved, like, oh, thank goodness, I felt safe again. But the other part was like, oh, I needed a guy to intervene for me to make this person listen. He should have listened to me. I was saying it loud. I was saying it concretely. Why do I need a man to come help me? You know, so it's like this myriad of emotions that makes you feel vulnerable on lots of different levels. But I took the, oh, thank goodness I had support. That's where I really sat. And then the part where I said, oh, why is my voice not being heard? That's where it really motivates me towards change. So I felt relief and I felt motivated towards change, you know, and that's really that kind of the intersectionality where, you know, you feel vulnerable, but also motivates you to make changes.
We have 2 comments in the chat. One of them for Britt. Thanks, Britt. Very good perspective. Also having others you can safely relate experiences with. ... For me, this deeply embedded bodily pain storage is released when I can talk about it. Another comment that was made was also avoid taking things personal and try to listen and understand others' feelings or beliefs. which are both good suggestions.
How about
Okay.
one more question just for,
Sure.
yeah.
Can we let's tackle a little bit about the person and environment perspective, just because I think that, you know, will relate to our practice as clinicians, right? So how can we apply person and the environment strategies to gain greater individuality and richer conversations? Oh, Robin, you might have stumped us with this one. Do you want to maybe start off and then we can jump in?
Well, I think when I'm, you know, as a social worker, when I'm talking to a client and I'm taking a look at I'm doing an assessment and I'm taking a look at what in their environment might be keeping them stuck or keeping them in that place, or preventing their strengths from really taking over, or even attacking, you know, their self-esteem. When I worked with incarcerated youth, I had a young man that was in for like 9 months, and he was in for like fire setting and stuff like that. And so he was starting to come out, and we were starting to talk about how to reunify him with his family and how to set him up for success. And he kept saying, and I'm just going to change his name, you know, for privacy. He kept saying, but yeah, I'm a Smith, and in this town, Smiths mean, you know, we're nothing in this town. We're all in jail. He really was identifying his name and his identity with his chances for success, and you know, what in his environment, what in his family name was keeping him in that space. And so that's what him and I really started to examine, and how he could change what that name meant in town, how he can empower himself to change what that name meant. So that's just one example. If that helps you understand what we're trying to talk about, how someone might get stuck in their environmental situation.
I think also we have to keep in mind as clinicians that nothing happens in a vacuum, and you cannot apply the same standards, the same set of expectations to one client that you do another one based on your experiences and your understandings and your standards. You have to have that humility, and it doesn't even have to be cultural humility. It can be human humility, just to say that you don't know everything, and you know you don't know everything. So ask questions and find out what their experiences are, so that you can kind of understand where they're coming from, and then go from that perspective and meet them where they are, so that you can help them along.
And I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to say one more thing. One of the teachers at the school also yesterday asked me, you know, what is the difference between allyship and saviorship? And no one's talking about saving anybody. Nobody's talking about that. As social workers, we want to empower everybody. I had a supervisor when I was in my MSW program that said, you're not here to rescue everybody or carry their burden. You're here to walk alongside them while they carry theirs. And that's what we're talking about in allyship, fellow travelers, right? We're here to lend a voice and support and change. We're not here to save anybody. So that kind of struck me, Britt, as you were talking, and you're 100% right. You know, being mindful of ourselves, but and also being mindful of empowering people and not taking over anything, right? Or even assuming they want support in that moment. I think there's, I was going to say there's one more comment in the chat that says, yes, and not assuming because of being white, you have not experienced the pain of patriarchy and white supremacy. It harms us all. Experiences of the past affect how we perceive now, unfortunately, and society needs social work healing. For sure.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Heather. Those are very good points. So,
oh, Sophia, do you want to comment? Yeah.
Sophia, please do.
Yeah, I do. One of the things that I wanted to say, and it was probably one of the most fascinating learning experiences, I'm trying to put my camera on. It was probably one of the most fascinating experiences that I have ever had is when I got out of the military, I wrote a grant to work with the poor and underserved, and I got a position as a faculty member at Meharry Medical College, which what many people don't know is probably larger than Howard in terms of historically graduating more African-American physicians than any other school. And so I worked there for about 3 years running this grant. And for the first time, I was a minority. And all of my clients were Black and African-American. Everybody I worked with was Black and African-American. And I would say maybe 1% of the faculty and the clients may have been Caucasian. And it was interesting how I was perceived and how I was treated. And like we would go to functions and I would notice that oftentimes I would sit alone and my family would sit alone. Now everyone would interact with us, but it was almost like we would sit alone. A lot of times when a lot of the female faculty went out, I wasn't invited. You know, I just wasn't invited. It wasn't that I was treated badly in any way, but I just wasn't part of the team. And for me, it was probably one of the greatest growing experiences I ever had in terms of sitting in that position and never realizing that or seeing that before. It was very interesting in terms of just looking at the other way. And if there's one thing I learned in social work is that we cannot ignore what we see going on around us. You know, we cannot. We can't make believe that we are colorless because we're not. You know, and we may not be perceived that way. And so I'm really pleased with almost everything that we've said because you really do have to take a good look at yourself. And as a white female, and my parents were immigrants, you know, we had no money, we struggled all the way up, but I have to tell you, it's a very different perspective. And really sitting in that chair made me realize that it was different, you know, and what some people had been talking about. So it was a really good learning experience for me. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Sophia, for sharing. Thank you. So we've run over time a little bit, so I apologize for that, but thank you to everyone.
Can I say one more thing?
You sure can. Hi, Olga.
Towards the end, we didn't get to the last question, but I just wanted to make a little point here in terms of intersectionality. I've always taught about intersectionality, but it became so real right after Pulse when I facilitated a group of Latinx, gay, bisexual, lesbian men and women who were also, most of them undocumented. And just the consequences of what happened to them post-Pulse as a result of being undocumented, as a result of being LGBTQ, as a result of being Latinx. It was fascinating to me, and how we always, you know, a lot of times we always just talk about Latinos or we talk about African Americans, but this intersectionality is so important, especially how oppressed they felt, because they were oppressed by all kinds of things, not just because of their race and ethnicity, which is bad in itself by itself, but also in terms of sexual orientation, so also in terms of their, some of them because of their gender, some of them because, you know, of their, like I said, the legal status that they were here in this country. So we got to keep in mind intersectionalities, how important they are when working with individuals and groups. That's it.
Thank you, Olga. I think Britt maybe wanted to make one last comment also. I didn't want to cut her off, so.
I was just going to ask, let me see, who was talking before? I can't.
Sophia?
Yes, I was going to ask Sophia if she would do anything differently if she had to do the experience again.
Yes, I would. What a great question. You know, it was funny because I didn't even realize the experience until after the experience. You know, it probably took me, I would say, at least 6 months or more of being out of that environment to really realize what had happened in that environment. And yes, what I learned is that there's an isolation component that I had never thought about. You know, I was different. You know, and I had never thought about that. I had thought about discrimination. I had thought about, but just the fact that I never fit in. You know, I was never quite with everybody else, even though I was, and I got the ultimate respect. Nobody treated me badly, but I just never fit. And that part of it just sat with me. And afterwards, whenever I work with clients, if there's one thing I truly do get is that we cannot ignore it. You know, we cannot make believe that it's not there, because it is there. Even as subtle as it may be, as if you never fit. You know, how does that affect the way that we respond to people and the way that we interact with them? And that probably, you know, the grant was great. I taught physicians how to work with underserved, poor and underserved. They taught me. But that experience just really stuck with me in terms of how gentle it was, but yet how real it was, and how badly it hurt that I never really could fit. And no matter what I did, I couldn't fit. I was different. I looked different, you know, and I was treated, although good, it was different. And it was so subtle that I think you have to experience that, you know, to know what that is. And it's just something that I learned such a great deal of in terms of when I interact with people in the future, because I realized what it felt like and it was there.
There's a really good speaker. Her name is Chandra Arthur. She talks about code switching quite a bit and what that, you know, feels like to have to, you know, be very conscientious of your speech, your positionality, your body language, your clothing. I mean, it's, I think you're touching on that a little. I mean, you're touching on a lot of things, Sophia, but that was one thing that came to my mind when you were talking about that, is that you were learning firsthand about code switching there. You know, and the pressure and the loneliness that can cause.
Yeah, and you know, I had a daughter, and my daughter was young, and so she would go a lot of the activities that we went to, and I would notice that, you know, she was different. I'll never forget, we went to a dinner one time, and I said to them, "Are we going to feed the children first?" You know, because that's usually what I did, is make sure my kid ate first, and then I ate. And the whole group looked at me like I had 10 heads, and they said, "Absolutely not. The adults eat first." You know, and I was like, "Oh, okay," you know, sorry. But just something as simple and little as that, you know, that, I mean, it never dawned on me. I mean, I started to fix a plate for my daughter, you know, and she was like, no, adults eat first. And I thought, okay. But just little things that, you know, you don't even think about.
You almost take for granted, right?
Yeah.
Well, listen, I know we're taking up a lot of time. You know, we knew we were going to have a hard time keeping it at a half an hour, and we, you know, I was supposed to speak for 45 minutes yesterday, and we actually went 3 hours. So there's a lot of conversation to be had, and so this is why this is the first of many brown bags that our committee wants to release. And so we thank you all for your time. We thank you all for coming out. We thank you all for being candid and leaning into the conversation and sharing. And please, you know, let us know. We're on Twitter, and we have a Facebook page, right, Renee? for the
That
committee.
is correct. There's a
So-
Facebook and Twitter, and also I think there's an Instagram. I'm not sure.
Let us
think
know
so.
what topics you'd like us to dive deeper into and bring forward for students as we do these brown bags, all right? And everybody have a great week. Thank you again for coming. Bye.